This video has been brought to you by the company that makes this Nestle tea infuser, which you can find for $12 at Amazon.com. And on that note, the goal of this video is to talk about some of the critics of design thinking. And hopefully, you've noticed in these readings that part of the criticism here comes from the disillusionment that a lot of people have with Silicon Valley as a whole. Early in Silicon Valley's history, there was a lot of enthusiasm about what it could accomplish. There were some people, for example, it's hard to imagine now, but there's some people that thought Twitter was going to revolutionize the world and enable the overthrow of totalitarian regimes and so forth. And really, at this point, we're kind of coming down to earth and starting to have a more realistic understanding of what technology can actually accomplish, right? And so that's part of where these arguments are coming from, right? So there are two main arguments that I think your texts are trying to articulate, two criticisms of design thinking, right? The first is this problem where designers are often put at the pedestal on the pedestal in the design thinking view, right? They're viewed as these kind of geniuses that can swoop down and solve the world's problems in one way or the other, right? And of course, that view's problematic, right? And we're going to go into some reasons why that might be, right? The second criticism has to do with sustainability and planned obsolescence and how design thinking tends to encourage continual innovation. And that sort of works against some of our environmental goals, right? And then finally, I want to return to this idea of interpretive engagement that Iskander talks about at the end of her piece. And she doesn't really explain, I think, this very well, right? I think a lot of the examples she uses in her piece are difficult to sort of wrap your mind around. And so part of my goal in this video is really just providing you better examples so you can more clearly see the arguments she's trying to make in her piece, right? So let's talk about this first thing, right? So the problem with this idea of viewing designers like Steve Jobs or Elon Musk or whatever as these solitary geniuses is that they make mistakes a lot, a whole lot actually, right? And some of these mistakes can be very detrimental to the people around them, right? And I'm just going to give you a couple examples, a couple really interesting examples. So one is kind of a silly one, but I think it's worth bringing up because it illustrates the design process so well, right? And this has to do with a disaster that occurred in Thailand a couple years ago, right? And what happened was there were a group of people, a group of kids with their soccer coach that went into a cave system, right? And then I don't know exactly what happened. I think the tide rose or something like that, and they ended up getting trapped within the caves, right? The water basically blocked them from exiting the system, right? And it was this huge media event. It went all across the world, right? People were really interested in it. And one of those people that got really interested was Elon Musk, right? And I'm not trashing Elon Musk here. I think he's a really smart guy, and I like him because I think he tries to do the right thing, even though I feel like he sometimes messes it up royally. But I think his heart's in the right place, and that's what I like about him, right? But what Elon Musk did is he wanted to see if his companies could maybe help these people out in some ways, right? So he sent some engineers down to Thailand to gather information, called down there himself and talked with a lot of the people down there, right? They gathered a bunch of resources and so forth and then sort of came back, right? And remember, this should remind you that first stage of the design process, right? Where you're developing empathy for the people that you're trying to help, right? So anyway, so he gathered all this information. And he got really obsessed with this idea of building a portable submarine that could fit a small child that they could use to escort the children out of the cave system, right? So he invested a lot of resources in this. He had his engineers working on them. They developed a working prototype that they tested out in their pools, right? They sent it down to Thailand, sort of left it with the authorities. And the problem is that this was a ridiculously horrible solution to the problems they were facing, right? Apparently, from what I understand, the cave systems are really narrow and have a lot of tight turns, and it just wouldn't be possible to navigate an object of this size through the cave system, right? And a lot of people ended up being kind of bitter about it because Elon Musk distracted a lot of attention from the problem, and people had to deal with him. They had to talk to him because he was a big figure, right? When the experts, the divers and so forth, were the ones who actually ended up solving the problem by sending rescuers in the cave and hauling them out the old-fashioned way, right? So it's a good example right here of design thinking's problems, right? There's kind of an arrogance that Elon Musk had to suppose that he could solve this problem better than all the people who have worked their entire lives to work through similar situations, right? And in doing so, he didn't necessarily cause any additional problems, but he did distract a lot of attention from the people who everybody needed to pay attention to, right? A little bit more of a high profile example, and there are lots of examples I could have pulled that from. These are just a couple of my favorites. This is called the One Laptop, One Laptop Per Child project, so OLPC. And this happened in the mid-aughts, was when the heyday of this project. And it was founded by Nicholas Negroponte, who is the founder of MIT Media Labs, which you may know. It's a famous organization. And their goal was to build a $100 laptop that they could ship to developing areas of the world, that could be used to help their education systems, right? And the ridiculousness of this idea should already be a little apparent. It's not necessarily a bad idea, but there are a lot of problems that people in the developing world have. They face diseases like malaria, right? They don't even have functioning school systems in a lot of cases, right? And so probably the last thing they need really is a laptop. There are a lot of other things that need to be fulfilled before they get there, right? But nevertheless, this project moved forward, and there's a lot of attention that's been focused on its technological unfeasibility, right? It ended up that they were underestimating how much it would cost to build the laptops. They ended up costing like $200 versus $100, and they ended up being slow as molasses and not very useful for that reason, right? But I think the bigger problem here is they weren't thinking through like what the community was going to use them for, right? And so they didn't provide a lot of training to the teachers, and in the end, a lot of people on the ground didn't even want to use them because they were slow and shoddy products, right? And so once again, there's another example of like this designer sort of swooping in trying to solve this problem without fully understanding what the community seems to actually need. So there seems to be a problem here. There seems to be a problem, this way of thinking about problems, right? Now, another issue is that design thinking tends to encourage innovation and doesn't focus enough on other things like sustainability. And this creates lots of problems in some cases, right? The best example of this is Apple products, right? Apple seems to roll out a new iPhone, pretty much every year, right? There's a big question of whether we need a new iPhone every year. And although they innovate, sometimes these innovations are small and not really that substantial, so forth. And then to make it even worse, they make it difficult for you to use their older products, right? So they often don't roll out software updates to earlier products. They make it difficult to repair their products for various reasons. And so this results in a lot of waste, right? People end up getting rid of things that they could perhaps repair, and they end up in landfills around the world where they are harvested for their precious metals and cause all kinds of environmental problems, right? So I'm going to turn things over to Motherboard, who's got a short little video on the right to repair movement, and they're going to talk about how this relates particularly to the farming industry. But I think you'll see real quickly how a lot of these ideas also apply to iPhones and other kinds of technological products.
I am actually the 5th generation farming here on this operation where you sit today. We've been around for a while, since the mid-1800s. The kids laugh because she's my cat. She follows me around more. The big tractors over here we use for the day-to-day operations in row crop farming. Anything that requires a lot of horsepower, a lot of traction. Those are both big issues for us. Smaller tractors like this little guy here, we use for maintenance of the yard. We use them a lot. These little tractors we use a lot in the vegetable operation. This is the tractor that I learned to drive tractor on. One of the things growing up on a farm that happens is you learn to do everything very young. As soon as I could sit on the very front edge of that seat and push that clutch in, I learned how to drive. And the beauty of that tractor in terms of repair is I can go anywhere and get parts for it. We could tear this thing down and overhaul it in probably a week's time. It's a different era for sure. The earliest developments were in the engines. And probably from the mid-'80s, we started to see computerized components in engines to the point where in the mid-'90s, essentially the entire engine is run by the computer. And so now today, all functions of the tractor are run by the computer. The seat in that tractor over there is more complicated than this entire tractor. As tractors have become more high-tech, the repairs have become more challenging. We do not have the ability to hook up a computer to a tractor to diagnose it, to repair it, or even to activate components that we may buy to put on that tractor, particularly with older tractors. We would buy used parts and put on them to save money. And today, I can go out, and there are used parts for these tractors, these newer tractors that are available, but if I put them on, the tractor won't run. This receiver is, for the most part, a perfectly functioning receiver, okay? What this does is it receives satellite signals from GPS satellites. TCM in this is broken, okay? It's not functioning. What we were told by Deere is, well, we don't support this anymore. So essentially what they did was they forced us to buy a new unit because they won't support this anymore, and we can't get the repairs for it.
So I showed this video to you for a couple reasons. The first thing I want to make clear is I'm not slamming John Deere. I think they're a great organization. They're doing a lot of wonderful things. I have a friend that works there. I have nothing but respect for the company, right? But I do think it shows us a couple things about design thinking that can be a little problematic, right? So the first is it illustrates planned obsolescence really well. So you see farmers here that are having to purchase brand new parts for their tractor because they're not able to repair the parts that already exist, right? And so they might be able to go in there and maybe make some changes, maybe, do a little soldering, that sort of thing, fix certain things themselves, but John Deere has basically made it impossible for them to do that, right? So that's one thing it illustrates. It illustrates that idea really well. But I think even more importantly, it illustrates this idea that Natasha Iskander reaches at the end of her piece of interpretive engagement, right? And it's not entirely clear what she means by this. I think, once again, because her examples aren't very good. She describes it as a process of collaboration and wide-ranging interpretation with no clear beginning and end. And I think she has this idea of continual collaboration sort of in mind, right? She wants us to start thinking of products and services as continuing to have relevance after they leave the shelves, right? So just because a product's been sold doesn't mean that's the end of its work that it needs to do, right? And so she wants to see designers and the community sort of working together to continually collaborate on the product, even after it's been produced, right? And the right to repair movement fits in this really well, right? So people are continuing to fix the product, continuing giving it new life as it works through its product cycle, right? But also, I think she has in mind even more than that. She has in mind the community working with the designers to improve the product, to change it, to make it work for new purposes, right? And I think, an example of this is the modding community, right? So people who jailbreak their phones to add new software to it, or people who modify existing software or video games or whatever to achieve new functionality, right? I think this is a really great example of this process of interpretive engagement, right? I know some people who play Skyrim think that mods have given the product essentially an endless life cycle, right? In a lot of ways, right? So I think that's kind of what she has in mind, right? So when you're looking at the products from Indiegogo, I want you to be thinking about this kind of stuff, right? So how many of the products have social justice messages, but don't really seem to embody them very well, right? They seem to be using it mostly as a marketing tactic, right? So that might be one thing that you choose to look at, right? How many products seem to have thought through the life cycle of the product itself and have a plan for continuing to work with the community to make the product viable over the long term, right? That might be another thing that you think about. And of course, sustainability goals just in general. So do products take into account sustainability, or do they seem to not really be concerned with that kind of stuff, right? So hopefully this gives you a few new things to think about as you work towards your product design analysis. And if you have any questions, once again, let me know.